Dear friends and supporters of the Käte Hamburger Center Law as Culture, dear Mamadou, salam alaikum. Comme on dit au Senegal. We would hereby welcome you to the talk by Mamadou Diouf, the title Constitution Making and Social Transformation in Africa. He still speaks about the Senegal, and we have been following the Senegalese style of playing football during the last weeks, and we liked it very much, I think, and rather successful. And it's a pity, if I see right, they did not go into the next round. Oh, what a pity. We would have liked really to have your comments on that, instead of some boring sociological and cultural and historical stuff about those nations and processes of nation buildings you are responsible of to speak about, because you are a historian, as I said, director of Columbia University's Institute for African Studies, and currently a second-time fellow. It's a new position we have invented at the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Law as Culture. So you said, you announced what you will say in your lecture, and you will do it yourself, of course, but at least some elements might be reminded. And this is the continuation of your research project, which deals with the political economy of African independence, a very large subject, but implied in the processes and trajectories of building a democratic nation state in Senegal, and we had recently more reasons to be interested in this process. I will come back to that. Specifically, the investigation raises the issue of how Senegal is an African nation between Islam and the West, and we learned during your last conference, your last talk, how much it is important to understand those, but some of the of African states and nation-building processes, also through the lenses of a sociology of religions, and in this case, it is about Islam. You can't get a correct image about Africa if you don't, if you are not familiar with at least some elements and some trends and some of early Islam that have been implanted and developed on the soil of Africa. In particular, there have been through religion and ethnicity basis for making representational claims in many African countries, and on the other side, not always contradicting, but might be a certain tension. Enlightenment strategies like universal citizenship and equality, expressed by the commitment to civil rights and democratic deliberation on the other side. So this, whether it's a tension, what kind of tension, I think this remains a main question for understanding the development in this, as we still have a lot of reasons to say dark on this dark continent. As you're always not only good, but it's promised always for surprises, I won't go more into details, especially as we had a communication question. I could not read your paper in advance, though you sent it to me. This had to do with my mailbox and not with your good intentions, and it's perhaps good. So I won't tell you too much about the content of his talk, and he's much more apt to tell the truth about Africa. In order to remind some of you about his background, Mamadou studied history at the University Paris-Sorbonne. Rather important to have a French background, where he received his doctorate some years ago. Dissertation dealing with the topic Le Cajol au XIXe siècle et la conquête coloniale, 1815 1885. This is important as a period of formative period. And then he worked as an associate professor in Dakar, Senegal, Quebec later on. Moreover, he was head of the Research, Information and Documentation Department of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA. I think this is a very important institutional context where you come from. And then you have been director for the African Studies at the University of Michigan. Michigan then lost his famous professor, because then you went to Columbia in order to be like a family professor of African Studies and the director of Columbia University's Institute for African Studies. In all his participations in commissions, you have to look into his CV. It is really extraordinary. It's pages and pages, another commission, a further commission, a sub-commission of the higher commission, etc. It's really crazy. You have to look at this. It's a scientific network he has built, and he's a center of that really is most impressive. And this is also the way we met at the Réseau des Instituts d'études en France, des études avancées en France. And they're not to be found in his biography. I have really looked very precisely. He was decorated with the Order of the Légion d'honneur en France. This means something, at least to some of us. This should be mentioned in the context of global scientific exchange, from Senegal to France, from here, there, back to Senegal, in order to arrive at the States, and doing African studies there. As Sheikh, our artist in residence, not present today, was painting African cinema at Cuba. This image is still next door. We had a wonderful evening with your compatriots some weeks ago, as I told you. Now we are looking forward to your talk that you will present during your renewed fellowship since June 2018 to continue your project at the Käte Hamburger Center Law as Culture. Once again, welcome at our center, and we are looking forward to listening to your always incredible and surprising insights and the way you can attract our attention to your way to explain the world. The floor is yours.
Thank you for a very generous presentation. I would like also to thank you and the co-directors of the centers for bringing me back. I spent 6 months here last year working on the same project. And what I would like to do today is to come back to what I have accumulated and done for 6 months and what I'm trying to complete on during these 6 weeks. Bearing in mind that when I returned to the US, I'm no longer the director of the Institute of the African Studies, but I became the chair of a huge department which is called Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies, which means that I returned to bureaucracy and trying to deal with 40 people who are very unruly people, which means that I didn't think for almost a year. So since I came back here and preparing my presentation, I asked myself one thing. Do I have to present a kind of continuation of my reflection, or am I going to think about what has happened, what I added to my reflection? By saying first that I'm still working with the same kind of archive. The archive I have built is an archive based on archival documents, newspapers, stories, interviews, but also close observation of political activities. Because what I'm interested in is a kind of inward-looking examination of the political processes. And I'm still addressing, if you want, the three key issues I'm interested in. The first issue is the problematic relationship between constitutionalism and community, social, cultural, and political tradition whose foundation is pluralism. Pluralism is key in the reflection I'm presenting. It's actually the device base in which I'm trying to understand the kind of crisis African societies are going through. I also think that it is probably the solution to the African crisis. Many years ago, one of the greatest thinkers of Africa, who was a British historian, Basil Davidson, who began writing on pre-colonial Africa, actually published his last book with the title, The Nation State, The Burden of African Communities. What he was interested in is to show that African societies have never been able to accumulate the nation state as a system and as a structure. And it's interesting to try to understand why. This is also something I will try to do today. So this is the first question. The second issue I'm interested in is the complex correlation between constitutionalism, political violence, weak institution, and the absence of functional institution, in particular the judiciary, and the lack of security. This is also important because it's part of the legacy of colonial domination. Two things has to be kept in mind. One is modernity is reaching Africa packaged in violence. Second, the judiciary is absent from colonial governance. And third, the issue of security is linked to the social organization of society. The color line is absolutely strong, which makes the Africans always guilty. The African has to be punished. The idea of punishing the African is one of the bases of colonial philosophy. It's why the ambiguity of Africans in relation to the so-called modern, from the institutional modern to the cultural, the so-called cultural modern. I will come back to that. The third issue is the ambiguous nature of the constitutional reform when conducted by authoritarian leaders that define the condition under which they are adopted. So the continuity between the colonial and the post-colonial has to be also kept in mind. The legacy of a post-colonial African state is colonial in structure. This is also important because it's not only Africa, it's not only in Africa if you want. And you will see that one of the theoreticians who influenced me a lot is one of my colleagues who is Indian and worked on India. He's called Partha Chatterjee. And what he is still interested in is the tension between what he called the domain of spirituality, which is what you can call the vernacular domain of the colonized. His word has always protected against an intervention of the colonial settler. And this is important because it's what has defined a kind of identity which turned in India around the idea of communalism, which is constructed around religion, which actually was the basis of the way in which the British governed India. In Africa, it's not called communalism, it's called ethnicity or tribalism, which is the way in which the African was born. And it was so important that Africans began fighting their identity, their ethnic identity, in courtrooms. Because what was called the customary law was precisely what was decided who is who, and under which customary law the person should be judged, condemned, or punished. So this is something which is important. How it was transported into the post-colonial and how it was reworked within the post-colonial space is something very important to understand if you want to understand the kind of gap between a text which exists over there and practices which has nothing to do with the text. Who is consuming the text? For whom the text is produced becomes an important element in the discussion about African society. The fourth issue is who owns the Constitution? Is it the Constitution of the people or the Constitution of the regime? Does the constitutional reform seek the reduction and control of the ruling elite's power, define right and duty of citizenship, and finally establish an independent judicial system? This is also important for a historian. If you look at the history which produced, in particular at the turn of the 18th century, European constitution, they are the product of, if we take a Marxist approach, of an emerging bourgeoisie fighting for its rights. So constitutions are the product of people trying, and they will be successful, trying to control the power of a political elite. And you see in Africa is exactly the reverse. Constitution is produced to establish and consolidate the power of the elite. And they control it. Is why, the number of constitutional amendments in Africa is astonishing. If you compare the American Constitution, 1787, and the Constitution of Senegal, adopted in 2000, and from 2000 to 2012, which is the two terms of the president elected then, he has amended successfully 15 times the Constitution. He has amended it 15 times and lost the 16th. And following that, that failure, he will lose also the presidency. But the idea that changing the Constitution is something which happens is part of the nature of constitutional exercise in Africa. And I can give also another very interesting example, what is called the African Spring, which began actually before the Arab Spring. Nobody thinks about that. In Africa, it began in the 90s. It's the democratization process and the end of the one-party system. It happened long before the Arab Spring. And one thing which was interesting in all the constitution of that period is you have term limits, 2 terms. In absolutely 80 to 90% of the cases, the president will be elected, re-elected, and try to change actually, the 2 terms to be elected the 3rd time. It's the discussion which is going on today in Ivory Coast. Is the current president Ouattara going to be elected? Seeking a 3rd term. Is what has happened in a country like Burkina Faso. But one of the interesting things is in Burkina Faso, the president was re-elected twice after this change in the Twitter. When he tried to change it again, he had a problem and finally also was ousted by a youth movement. In Senegal, in 2012, the president decided that his first term didn't count. So he had to add a third term. Unfortunately for him, he was voted out by the population. I will come back to that. It's just to provide a kind of framework which allows you to understand the kind of discussion going on. On one hand, the textual, the production of the text, and on the other, the idea the text could be changed, and it's always changing. So this is really an important discussion about who owns the Constitution. And the last issue I'm interested in is the procedures under which, the condition in which new constitutions are manufactured. What makes a regime decide to change the Constitution? And what is the relationship between those different constitutions? So what is important to keep in mind in this discussion and the way in which I'm conducting it is I'm trying to index the discussion. I'm trying to understand what are the terms which are the terms based on which the discussion is conducted. Keeping in mind that the legal has played a very, very important role in the discussion about African independence and African liberation. The nationalist elite that fought against colonialism mobilized the vocabulary of citizenship, the vocabulary of liberal democracy against, actually, the colonial administration. They fought for equality. They were not necessarily fighting for independence. They were fighting for integration. And the French has pushed that much further by making these changes, in particular after World War II, by creating what my colleague Fred Cooper has studied, imperial citizenship. The French believed that it was possible to save the empire by granting citizenship, but a different citizenship, of course, to the metropolitan citizen, to their colonial subject. And the discussion was a kind of very important discussion, because it was the only moment, in particular in 1944, where the constitution which was proposed, and it was heavily influenced by two black politicians, but were also, two of the greatest poets of France and the French language, Aimé Césaire and Léopold Sédar Senghor. They decided to turn France into a multicultural state, which is something which is amazing when you think about French absolute and violent rejection of multiculturalism and communitarianism today. But this was in, and if you go back to the 1944 Constitution, is inside. So the Greater France, which became, and it didn't work. Because it didn't work, nationalists decided to fight for independence. But what I wanted to just highlight is the very fact that the elite insisted on the operation of a legal system, and it has a critical function. It has to demonstrate the administrative and rhetorical commitment to the law by the political elite. The language of law and order figure significantly in the performance of the state legitimacy and the theater of nation building in Africa. It shaped very powerfully the perimeter and content of the public space. So these are the questions I am exploring, but I'm exploring them in a broader African context, the context of independence, the political economy of independence. And Senegal this time will be only used to illustrate some of the questions which are important questions. But this is Senegal, and I will come back to this map because it's an important map. And if you want to look to Senegal in a larger African context, it's here is the westernmost outpost of Africa in the Atlantic. And it's why it's a country, as Werner mentioned it, the expression an African nation between Islam and the West is the subtitle of a book written by an American-Israeli sociologist, Sheldon Gellert. And if you look at the map, the south of the Sahara is a country which has a population, the Muslim population of 94%. But it's also in the Atlantic and played a critical role during the Atlantic slave trade and what is supposedly the beginning of a modern Atlantic and the connections, the world connection between Europe, the Americas, and Africa. And that tension between East and West is still very, very important. Because very early in this region you have Muslim theocracies, Muslim state emerging in the conflict with slave traders. So, and you have a tradition which is very important if you are following what is happening in this region with the G5 and all these, attacks. You have a tradition of jihads here, which has nothing to do with the new tradition of jihads. And one of the groups emerging in Mali, which is a group of Fulani, are within a tradition which is soliciting a history, which is a long history of jihad. The first jihad in this region is the early 18th century. And these are people who are well educated in the science of Islam, who have created their own school, their own tradition, and who have been competing with North Africa, who have been traveling. You have to also understand that in Cairo and Al-Aqsa, you have already West Africans actually managing houses for students, 13th century. So Islam is part of the culture of this region. And this is very important to keep in mind if we want to understand what has happened. But it's also what explains what was so-called exceptionality of this country. As I say, 90% of the population is Muslim. The first president for 20 years was a Catholic. And it was not a problem. Not only it was not a problem, but it's part of the discussion. But this Catholic president decided, and this is, I was discussing, this is the kind of relationship which has happened between this country and Tunisia. The best friend of this president, Senghor, was Bourguiba. They created what is called the Francophonie organization. But where Bourguiba was able to ban polygamy, Senghor was not. And for years he tried to find a way out. He is Catholic. Why could he go and tell people, you know, what you do is bad, so we are going to change it? But he found a way, which was to change the family code. And this is also very, the French has never tried to have an état civil, as they call it, or the family code in their colonies in Africa. People were marrying, divorcing, inheriting, based again on the loi coutumière. I will come back to that, except for a small group of people. But one thing which is, so, from 1960 independence to 1974, we didn't have a family code. So Senghor decided to come up with a family code as a way, as his, one of the way to modernize the society. The first way was to change the land system. The second was to rethink the administration. And the third was the family code. And the family code decided to establish regimes. One regime polygamy, one regime monogamy. But what has changed is for the first time people are marrying in front of the judge. If they go to the mosque, they still have to register in front of the judge. But the two partners has to agree on the regime, which is that if you say that you are polygamist, you have to choose between 2 wives to 4 wives. But the twist, which was a kind of fascinating twist, was Senghor decided that if you choose polygamy and you divorce, you could revert to choosing monogamy. But if you choose monogamy, even if you divorce, it's for life. You cannot change the regime. Which was for him a way of changing the system. He changed it also the inheritance, so by rejecting the idea that a woman will get 1/5. And he legalized divorce also, which actually entitled the possibility for a woman to get a pension from her home. So this has changed a lot, and the law was voted by the National Assembly, where actually 90% of the representatives were all Muslim. But I will come back to that. But at the same time, the Senegalese clerics, which has played a critical role in the formation even of the colonial state, resisted that and were defeated. And this is very important to understand in the way in which what is called the Senegalese success story and exception was built. What has happened during the colonial period, actually at the end of the territorial conquest in 1895, because of the many jihads conducted by Muslim clerics, the French didn't want to take them up as intermediaries. They decided to work with traditional chiefs. But traditional chiefs were corrupted and finally did not represent the population, where Muslim clerics had a huge popularity, was serving the people while getting resources from the people. So until World War I, the French resisted incorporating them in the system. But at the end of the World War I, they were forced to get them into the system. They created a kind of indirect government in which clerics played a critical role. In particular, they were the drivers of the key product of colonization, which were groundnuts. The success of groundnuts was assured by these clerics. And they were able also to collect taxes and reverse them. So this system, which was created by the French, putting the clerics as the intermediaries, made this region, which is the most important region of Senegal, the center here, which is basically the country, the region occupied by the largest ethnic group, the Wolof, the most important space, the most important region of the colonial space. And the whole architecture of the French state was built on an economy based on groundnut, but on a system, which was a system which was maintained by the clerics. And that state, I call it the Islamo-Wolof state. That the colonial French state is the Islamo-Wolof state. Which means that, and it's very interesting, that clerics were at the same time representing the population, but also they were the agent of the colonial state. And that tension is part of what is the Senegalese success story, based on what a colleague, political scientist who died a few years ago, Donald Cruz O'Brien, called the social contract between the clerics and the French. And the social contract is an exchange, actually, of support and resources between the two. What it has created is a translation, if you want, of colonial governance in the vernacular. They were able to explain the colonial state to, actually, the population, the peasants in particular. But they were able also to explain the peasant to the colonial state. So it's not a kind of direct subordination, it's a kind of negotiation. It's based on transaction. The transactional aspect is critical to understand what is going on. And this Islamo-Wolof state, I will come back to that, is still going on in the post-colonial. It has changed, it was redefined. So one of my hypotheses is that probably we are at the end of this arrangement. And I will talk a little bit about that. But one thing which is important in the description I have been making is the fact that because of their centrality in the system since the colonial period, Donald Cruz O'Brien, again, he began working on one of the largest groups, the Mourids, in 1970. At the end of his life, he began saying that the success story of Senegal is based on one thing, that the clerics are really the civil society, that they are in a position to negotiate. They are in a position to tell the state, you cannot do this. And the state is forced to negotiate. And this process of negotiation becomes very important. Of course, and I will mention that, it has an impact on the way in which the political space is organized. It has an impact on the key issues of political parties. And earlier it manifested. In 1958, in the context of the Algerian War of Independence, when de Gaulle came back, everybody was expecting that he will actually resist decolonization. He decided to have an approach which was different, reforming the empire, to actually maintain it. And he decided to organize the famous 1958 referendum with one question: do you want immediate independence, or if you want autonomy within the French Union? He took back the 1944 idea, but erasing, of course, the multiculturalism aspect, the existence of many people in one empire. And the debate among politicians was what to choose, yes or no. And the majority of the African parties met at Cotonou in Benin and decided for the no. The Senegalese delegation came back, and the clerics told them, okay, we have heard about your meeting in Cotonou and the decision you have taken. But guess what? We are going to campaign for the yes. Because the French are our friends. So, we are not telling, you can go and campaign. But you know what? We have more disciples than you have military, which was true. So, you go to campaign, we are going to campaign, and you will lose. So you choose. So, but Senegalese politicians were forced to follow. They were forced to campaign for the yes. And the only country which campaigned for the no and became independent is this small country which is called Guinea, in south of Senegal, Guinea of Sekou Touré. And what is interesting is this is just 2 years before independence, if you want, the victory of a man, the victory of a system, of a political system which is not horizontal, which is vertical. It's a patron-client system. When actually the new state, with the new constitution, was actually promoting citizenship, horizontal, tie. So, but it's interesting to follow this early relationship between the post-colonial elite and the clerics. Because at independence in 1960, the first discussion about the Constitution is a discussion between the clerics and the westernized elite. The clerics sent a delegation to the two most powerful politicians, Senghor, who was the president, and Mamadou Diouf, his prime minister. As I say, Senghor is a Catholic, Mamadou Diouf is a Muslim, and is a Muslim erudite. But he is also one of the best economists of his generation. But he is a Muslim anti the Senegalese clerics. But Senegalese clerics are part of Sufi networks. They are Sufis. Mamadou Diouf is a kind of modernist Islam, was basically influenced by Ben Badis, the Algerian, which are the group of people who were trying to modernize Islam and get rid. This is also something very interesting in relation to what will happen with radical Islam. This is a kind of Islam which is modern, which is trying to fit Islam into a process of modernization. And for Mamadou Diouf, getting rid of the Marabout for him was the only solution to create mass political parties. He wanted to get rid of them. He didn't want to always go through them to have access to the peasant. So, and when the Marabout showed up at independence and decided that they asked for basically we asked for a Muslim constitution, an Islamic constitution. So as I say, in 58, the political elite lost the referendum battle. In 1960, they refused. They fought and said they want a secular constitution. And they won. The politicians were able to impose that. But it's created also a kind of very complicated situation because the party was still actually relying on the Marabouts to constitute his political basis. And the Marabouts were still able to influence the whole system through the militant. And it's created the first crisis in the Senegalese state, which is the 1962 crisis between the President Senghor and Mamadou Diouf, the Prime Minister. And one thing which is interesting is religious leaders were split. Not split within Islam, but the split was between all the Muslim clerics who were supporting Senghor against the Muslim Prime Minister, who was supported only by the Cardinal Archbishop of Dakar, and who kept supporting him for the 14 years he stayed in jail. And the interesting thing is that the then Cardinal was born in the same village as Senghor and was from the same ethnic group. But he did not, he was against him, he did not support him. So this is also something very interesting to understand the dynamics based in which, you know, this country went through. So this is one aspect of the success story, the way in which the country was built since the colonial period and how in the post-colonial moment the first 10 years were years of adjustment. And one thing which is important to add into this whole idea of a success story is one of the few countries in Africa which has never experienced a military coup. It has always held elections. The elections were manipulated, whatever you want, but it has always held elections. And the other very interesting aspect is one of the first African countries which went through a regime change in 2000 and in 2012. This is also a very important aspect of the history of the country. And about constitution, an aspect which is important, after the 1962 crisis, the constitution of the First Republic was a constitution based on multi-parties. 62, the crisis, we have the second constitution, the Second Republic. And one thing which is interesting is he's maintained the multi-party system. Why parties were banned administratively. And this tension has been kept. Senghor didn't change the spirit of the constitution while imposing what he will never call a one-party system, which is but as you know, he's a grammarian, so, as he puts it, fluent in Latin and Greek. So he was able to play the game. He said, it has never been a party unique. It's a party dominant. But of course you say, okay, if you have a dominant party, you should have other parties. No, for him, the party. And the idea that you have to pull people together is one of the most critical ideas in Africa. which is actually if you want, the justification of a one-party system. It's different from the Leninist party. It has nothing to do with that idea of Lenin. But it's about these African societies are ethnically or religiously fragmented. The only way you can build a new nation and a new state is to create a kind of homogeneity which will allow us to control, in particular, the enemies of the countries. So it's a reaction to something which is there, which is true, but it's also a way for the elite to build their power based on using the same resources they are condemning, the resources of ethnicity or the resources of religion. For Senegal, this has been always very complex because of the nature of the largest ethnic group, the Wolof. As I told you, they are one of the pillars of the Islamo-Wolof state. Their language became very quickly the lingua franca of the colony, because the main cities were areas, because they were educated very quickly. They are Muslim, so they created a kind of what I call a Wolof modernity. A Wolof modernity which allows actually the Wolof not only to define themselves as Muslim, different from the Arabs, but also to define themselves as, civilized people different from the French. They used to tell the French, if you say that civilization is having a script, we have a script, which is Arabic. If you think that is about philosophizing, in this region, people have been reading Plato and Aristotle in Arabic. So what are you talking about? And writing about it, and they could show proofs that they were actually interpreting philosophy, and they were doing it in relation to theology. The idea of what they call philosophy in relation to philosophy is something very important in the making of an intellectual culture in this region, the region of Timbuktu. It has spread a lot. So you have a kind of intellectual approach. One of my friends wrote a wonderful book which is called Beyond Timbuktu, Usman Khan, which is showing the emergence and production of a knowledge which is neither limited to the Arab world, nor to what he called the Europhone knowledge. So the idea that you have a Timbuktu knowledge becomes an important thing. And this is important also because people in this region has been traveling a lot, not only for trade, but they were traveling a lot also to buy books. I studied a 19th century Senegalese trader who was born in 1842 and died in 1910. He has accumulated so much wealth that every 2 years he will travel to Cairo, to Alexandria, and to Jerusalem to buy books only. So, and this is the kind of culture, and this is the important element, this is being used in for discussion, if you want, about the exceptionality of Senegal. So, the kind of theoretical architecture I have built in trying to understand these many phenomena I have been presenting is I have first using one of the most popular texts, which is being used by people who are working on citizenship, which is the book by T.H. Marshall, which is T.H. He signed T.H., but his name is Thomas Humphrey Marshall. And his book, Citizenship and Social, his book is Citizenship and Social Class, an Over Essay, which was produced in 1950. And it's really one of the most referred books in the literature on citizenship. He distinguishes two levels of citizenship that are, according to him, sequentially arranged. But the sequencing is being debated by, new scholars. But the three levels are what he called the civil, the protection of the person, the political, the participation in politics, and the social, claim on at least a minimum level of collective resource. So this is the first book, and I think you have sense how I'm using it in my appreciation of different situations. The second book which has played an important role in my approach is a book by an American historian, Michael Cameron, and his book is titled The Machines That Would Go of Itself. It was published in 1986, 200 years of the American Constitution. And in his book, he proposes what are the elements, which makes a good constitution. He talks about the text, which is the law and the resulting practice, the kind of technical aspect which lawyers participate in. But he said that we need, if we want to see what makes a constitution successful, that you have always two constitutions. You have a text, which is the architecture and structure of government, of administration, and you have what he called the emotional, affective constitution, which spell out the individual right and present the ideals and goals. It feeds the public imagination. And this is very important, in particular in relation to Africa. He is insisting on the individual. But in societies where the process of individuation is not complete or even done, what basis do you have to consider? Because the collective is superseding the individual. So I think that it's an important aspect. But the second aspect of Cameron, which is interesting, is the insistence on the raw material which are constituting this second text, is what he calls how the legal text is translated into an imaginary text, and how it becomes a narrative, how it's become, the French probably word is better, how it becomes a récit. If a constitution is not a récit, it's not healthy, it's not successful. So I use Cameron for that, to track the récit. I use him to try to understand how different sediments are playing a role into that, that movement. The third historian, Marshall is not a historian, but the second historian I'm using is Fred Cooper. Cooper has been writing on empire and the French Empire. He has published a very, very successful book, which is becoming the world history textbook with Jane Burbank, which is called Empire in World History. And Empire in World History is a discussion about, quote unquote, the modernity of the nation state. It's a contestation of the modernity of the nation state. And it's a kind of bringing back empire has pluralistic societies and has actually construction which has been able to manage pluralism. And the key issue, the key illustration is the Ottoman Empire and an idea of citizenship which is very different from the citizenship it has developed in the past. And what Fred teaches us is that citizenship is not strictly limited to what we call rights, duties, and responsibilities. He says that it's a claim-making process. You cannot understand citizenship if you don't think about citizenship as who can make claims. You see it in the discussion between Merkel and her minister. It's about who has the right to make claims on a state at a given moment and who should be excluded from that. And what citizenship allows or close down is the possibility to be part of that. And again, the second lesson from Fred's studies is citizenship is always argued for. It's not only narrated, but it's also argumented. So this is also something important which we allow to. And the last political scientist, and he's a political, I'm using, and I mentioned his partner Chatterjee, who writes on India, and who is interested in two things. He is a political scientist who did his PhD on game theory, but he has probably written the best history books on Bengal. Why? Because he's interested at testing, if you want, political science concepts, borrowed from the West, used in different environments, and testing them to see how they work or not. And what he does, which is also very useful for an African, is to make a distinction between citizenship. And he says that citizenship inhabits the domain of theory. The concept of citizenship carries the ethical connotation of participation in the sovereignty of the state. But he distinguishes that from population. And this is, of course, it brings Foucault, for whom governmentality is about territory and what he called target cities, population. And for Chatterjee, population occupies the domain of policy. Unlike the concept of citizen, the concept of population is wholly descriptive and empirical. It does not carry a normative burden. And it's very, very interesting to compare it to constitutions which are in quest of norms about the population and how to govern it. Chatterjee is saying that it's quite impossible. Population are, why? Because population are identifiable, classifiable, and describable by empirical and behavior criteria and are amenable to statistical techniques such as census and survey. The concept of population makes available to government functionaries a set of rationally manipulable instruments for reaching large sections of the inhabitants of a country as the target of their policy. Economic policy, administrative policy, law and legal mobilization. What he's insisting in is, if you want, one of the premises of colonial governance, that people are not governed. Because when you are governed, you are represented. People are administered like things. And it's this tension which becomes important, which was actually moved into also the post-colonial world. The idea that it's not a rule of law, which has never been what the colonists is ruled by law. And this is where the notion of population is. So I'm using all this literature to show two things. Because of the closure of the political and public space, the only way to intervene, to operate within the system, to try to change it or affect it, is through kind of deliberative action. And in many cases, it's culture which is playing such a role. The way in which people are mobilizing the resources at their disposal. And in many cases, the very fact that even if population are classifiable, it's very hard sometimes for the governing elite to understand how they operate, to understand how they act into the system. Why? Because precisely the cultures they are mobilized against, if you want, what you can call the legal culture. And they are using a kind of juxtaposition and imbrication of various constantly reshaped references, assembling pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial histories and memories. They nurse the tension between the administrative and the governmental and establish paradoxical relationship to the law. Because the law is no longer servicing politics. The law is trying to frame politics. If you want, is what is happening today in Senegal with the young Minister of Justice, who is a professor of law, who has been helping the president use the law to, we have election next year, to eliminate all the candidates in a position to beat him. And the police and the Ministry of Justice are actually providing in any issue a response which is legal. They are not fighting on the political arena using political resources. They are drawing on the law. The law they are passing at the National Assembly to actually basically push politics out of the public space. And they are using the police and, the law against corruption in particular. One of the most important opponents, who is the mayor of Dakar, who was elected at the National Assembly, is in jail since last year on a basis of corruption. When in the president's own party, people are much more corrupt. So this is also an interesting aspect in understanding how things have been changing. So what I have tried to do, I'm going to go very quickly, is that look now at what I call governmentality in Africa. How Africans were governed. And in this governmentality, I'm going from the pre-colonial to the colonial. And the pre-colonial is very important, as I say, because what we are living today, the legal cultures, plural, we are living, are cultures drawn from these different sequences. And this is something very important, because it's very different from the idea of norm in the modern legal literature. The idea of having a law which is fixed. If I give an example with land tenure, in the European tradition, land tenure is about saying this is the property of X, and it has specific bounds. In the pre-colonial African system, you don't have that. You don't have this idea of geography. Or it's a geography which is always uncertain. You never know where are the limits. One, because it's not individual, it's collective. And you never, It's true for a state, it's true for a community. Why? And you ask me, why is it? So, because people were able to say this is where it stopped. But because the uncertainty was the way of establishing a continuous discussion. People were always in a position to discuss. That I will do part of my piece of land, I can go up to, some of your piece. But we'll debate this year, next year you will do it. So the idea that people are forced to negotiate is part of a contract. The contract does not close the possibility of discussion, of an ongoing discussion. The contract in the Western modern world closes the discussion. We have a contract. Here you cannot have a contract. So the other key is that power is always horizontal and segmented. And the idea is you move between different spaces of power. Because you have two rules which govern African societies. Is the rule of gender and the rule of generation. But in the rule of genders and generation, you have a kind of motricity. Because according to historians, generational conflict is actually the driver of African history. The idea that generations are changing. But the power of the elders is based on, this is the gender rule, based on the control of women. Access to women, they control each other, they have power. So these are very interesting. But one of the most interesting way of comparing the different logics, the logic of pre-colonial African society and the logic of modern society, is to read the anthropologist I consider as one of the greatest French anthropologists, Marc Auger. He has written a book which is called The Génie du Paganisme, The Genius of Paganism. And he defined what he called the logic of paganism. I don't want to go into it, but one things which are very, very interesting he saying is that paganism is never dualistic. The distinction between the soul here, the body there, the faith here, the knowledge here, doesn't exist. The world is not conceived as an external principle to the relation of force and meaning. It is the sum of those relations and nothing else. There is no discontinuity between the biological order and the social order. Every event makes sense and sign. But there is no sense prior or external to the society. Transcendence doesn't exist in the paradise. And it's true for the Greek gods. It's not only African gods. Greek gods are other. It's a kind of a plasticity of the sacred. And for him you have an opposition between paganism and Christianity. And it passes through different representation of life, of the human, and more precisely of the individual. This difference is based on free assertion, which I thought. Paganism is never dualistic. It does not recognize the autonomy of the transcendent morality, and does not introduce a brutal break between different. And this discussion about paganism has been actually reopened by a professor of law who has been for 10 years the dean of the more, it seems, it's what the Americans pretend, it's not me, that the greatest school of law in the whole world is Yale School of Law. It's not me, the American pretend. Sometimes I think it's true. And this man who was the dean is Anthony T. Kronman. He published in in 2016, I found that book is a book of 700 pages because I'm fascinated by this discussion about prejudice. And this man is both a philosopher and a lawyer. He has 2 PhDs, a PhD in law and a PhD. First a PhD in philosophy and after a PhD. And he published this huge book which is called Confession of a Born Again Pagan. And is about pluralism. And this is something which is interesting. And this allows me to discuss the idea of governance, colonial governance, and what are the main elements of colonial governance, the legacy of colonial governance, and the relationship. And you have also here a very, very important literature with people having different views. One of the view is the discussion about the context in which colonial governments developed. According to Patu Chatterjee, is developed within what he called a context dominated by what he called the rule of difference. And this is very important because the rule of difference excluded the colonized from the space of government, from the space of representation. Fred Cooper calls it the politics of difference, meaning that it's not as rigid as Barton is discussing. And if you compare their approach to Mahmoud Mamdani's approach, in his book Citizen and Subject, Contemporary Africa and the Legacy of Late Colonialism, it was published in 1993. And it was re-edited just a few weeks with a new introduction. And his idea of a bifurcated state, a colonial state which is on one hand actually using what I was calling, the traditional domain and customary law, and on the other for citizen using citizenship. A relationship between the village as a public space and the city, and what he called the bifurcated state, which is based on what he called decentralized despotism. And for him, because Africans were ethnically administered, the only language at their disposal to revolt was ethnicity. These wide parties were created based on ethnicity. I've also an African sociologist, a Nigerian, who is probably one of the first to pay attention to that. His name is Peter Eke. He has published a paper which is called Colonialism and the Republics in Africa, a theoretical statement, where he talks about these 2 publics, the civic public of a modern state. This is what Chatterjee called the domain of sovereignty, which rely on the colonial knowledge and colonial institution. He calls it the civic. And the other, which is the traditional, he called the primordial, which I mentioned Chatterjee calls it the domain of spirituality. And it's how ethnicity is trumping to be the idea of a modern state in the African society. So this is where I deal with what I call the governmentality. The second element which is important is how communities are imagined in Africa. This is important because of the existence of multiple forms of belonging. And the 4 very important questions Africans are still dealing with, which I have talked about in my earlier part, and the responses which were proposed, which are very, very interesting, because it's very different. If you take a radical African president of the early 60s, they decided to destroy these primordial communities and destroy the chiefs. Sekou Touré, Ismo Di Boketa. But as you take, I talked about Senghor, they reaccommodated the system and created a patronage clientelist system and contradicted the very idea of modernizing the state. So, which means that, the discussion about organization was very important. I'm not going to go into it to discuss it, but the idea of the discussion about the legitimacy of a one-party state and how it was approached by the first generation of American political scientists arriving in Africa is really interesting. The first political scientists arriving in Africa at independence. And they began studying politics in Africa long before the Europeans. They believed that politics existed in Africa, which was not the case for anthropologists, European anthropologists. So, and they have done a quite great and interesting job. I have talked about my conclusion, how the success of the Senegalese, if you want, project was based on this Islamic wall of state, and how today, because of the intervention of the legal and the law, the whole system is crumbling down. So thank you.